Tonight's speaker is Dr. Andreas Waldkirch. We had a discussion about, should we say it the German way or the American way? He's the Mitchell Family Professor of Economics at Colby College and is an internationally recognized scholar in the field of international economics with an expertise in foreign direct investment, multinational firms, trade policy, and economic development. His research explores how global capital flows and multinational enterprises influence regional growth, labor markets, productivity, and public finance. A significant portion of his work analyzes the economic effects of foreign investment on host economies, including questions of taxation, firm behavior, and policy competition between countries. His scholarship combines rigorous empirical methods with policy-relevant analysis, contributing to major conversations about globalization, economic integration, and the role of multinational corporations in shaping both advanced and emerging economies. We're very happy to welcome here tonight to talk to us about the issue of tariffs, a very timely topic. I'll turn things over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah. All right, very good. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk on tariffs. Not sure how much I'm going to talk about foreign policy per se, but certainly trade policy and some stuff that's going on in the world economy. So, of course, being in Maine here, right, a lot of us enjoy a nice lobster, and this is a very nicely proportioned one. It looks like perfectly steamed and everything. And this is kind of how I think about the ideal trading system, the world trading system, right? So it should look nice, it should be well organized, it should be orderly, there should be rules, there should be low tariffs, if any tariffs at all, right? And there should be ways that trade disputes are going to be handled in a fair and transparent way. So that is how we would like things. However, that's not where we are. So this is what I call the new world of tariffs. So I've been teaching trade for over 25 years. And for the longest time, people were interested in, trade, that seems sort of interesting, but tariffs, well, they're low, they're not something that we really want to think about. And that's certainly been true for many years until very recently. And so I just want to start off by giving you some highlights to make sure we are sort of on the same page of what has been happening. So really nothing until 2018. And then in 2018, there was, somewhat surprisingly to economists and maybe to the public as well, sort of a first wave of tariffs. And they started off sort of very innocently and very targeted. So I have a couple of examples here. Solar panels were among the first goods that were hit with pretty substantial tariffs. Washing machines was another one, right? So that seemed kind of arbitrary. Next, however, came tariffs, widespread tariffs on steel and aluminum, and those got a lot more attention because those are important and big industries in the United States and all over the world. And then all of a sudden, boom, we were hitting an entire country with limited exceptions, but there were basically tariffs just on China, regardless of what products we're talking about. It's like, well, Chinese imports is something that we're really worried about, so let's put pretty high tariffs on the country as a whole. Then came the end of that administration, and of course we had sort of an interregnum, as I would call it. And what was really surprising to trade economists during that time was we thought that, well, the Democrats really are now sort of the party of free trade. There's going to be rollbacks, right? We're going to go and take those tariffs off. And it turned out that there were very, very limited rollbacks. There were some. So some of the tariffs had hit allies in Europe, Mexico as well. And so there was a little bit of rollback there. But there were also new tariffs that were introduced, for example, on EVs and specifically Chinese EVs. So there's a reason that we have virtually no Chinese EVs at all in the United States. Whereas when you travel to, Central America, South America, you see a lot of Chinese EVs. And they're really great cars, and they're really cheap. right? But we don't have them. And then, of course, we have new administration, and from January to March, so new tariffs started right away, but again, they were fairly limited, and they came out with justifications that were grounded in US trade law, and I have a little bit more to say later on. And then April rolled around, and all of a sudden, we went to tariffs that were widespread, and that affected virtually all countries in the world, regardless of whether they were friendly countries or countries that we were not so friendly with, regardless of whether we had big trade relationships like with China or with the European Union or very small relationships. They all got hit with tariffs, blanket tariffs. And those were based on an obscure law that, frankly, I hadn't heard of before because it wasn't used, right? It was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, as people like to call it. And that came out, and the administration said, well, there's an emergency, an international emergency, and it affects the US, and it affects trade relationships with everybody, so we're going to put these tariffs on everybody. Then, of course, you know, I had already sort of half prepared this talk and thought like, okay, that's the highlights, let's move on. And then, of course, came 2 weeks ago the Supreme Court decision that said, no, you can't do that. That's actually unconstitutional to have these broad-based, widespread tariffs that hit everybody, and where, of course, also the height of the tariffs, how much we put on a country, seem pretty arbitrary in many ways, right? Somebody gets 10%, somebody else gets 19%, 39%, and so forth. But then, of course, it didn't take really a day until the administration said, well, if we can't base our broad-based tariffs on IEPA, we're going to find some other law or some other way to impose tariffs. So right away, we were told there are still blanket tariffs, 10%. Then a few hours later, it was 15%, but it turns out right now we are in the 10% regime. It's not so clear if we actually get to the 15% regime. And of course, I also have some question marks here. Is that really based in trade law? The administration says yes, but of course, as with all of those things, the courts will probably have something to say about that. All right, so those are sort of the highlights on what happened with tariffs. I want to take you a little bit out of the immediacy and show you what has happened over time with tariffs. So this is a very broad picture here. So we start 150 years ago, 1870, and it goes to almost the present here. And it shows you two things. It shows you, first of all, in red, what are tariffs, average tariffs across the world. And in blue, it shows you what the average tariff of the United States, the average import tariff, has been over this time period. So there's a number of things that stand out. So if we look at the ancient times here, right before the disruptions through the world wars and the Great Depression, we can see that world tariffs actually were going up a little bit. We're sort of hovering around 15%, maybe a little bit more. But US tariffs were actually quite high. And there was a lot of volatility here, right? So we reach here over 45%. We are sort of in the 20 to 30% range here. And this is something that you hear the administration sometimes talking about, that here, this was the golden age when the US did very well, when in fact the US became a world economic superpower. And it was a time indeed of high tariffs, right? So it's sort of easy to make that argument that, well, high tariffs did us a lot of good during this time. Why can't they do that again? But then after the long disruption with the world wars and the Great Depression came the post-war period. And the post-war period was very much marked by declining tariffs, right? So if you look at the world tariffs, this is clearly sort of a downward trend line. And we end up sort of in the mid-2010s with average tariffs that were less than 5%. And when we look at the US tariffs, they were lower than world tariffs, also had sort of this downward trend with a little bit of volatility. And we ended up somewhere in the 3% range, right? And so I started teaching in 1999, right? And so tariffs were low. They didn't really matter too much, so nobody was really too interested. The chart kind of ends in 2020, so this blue line at the end here, you can already see a little bit this upward trend from this initial wave of tariffs. But this is where we were for a long time. So here is a chart that focuses a little bit on China, but is also more broad. And so this looks at the evolution of tariffs between January 2018 and sort of now, where we are. And it kind of looks like initially those tariffs were not too high, but it's really deceptive because you have this unfortunate very short time period here where tariffs went up to over 140%. And so to make the chart work, right, and not have this go off the chart, you have to have a scale that's a little misleading. But I can zoom in a little bit, so this probably shows this a little bit better, what's been happening in the last year, and where we kind of ended up, where we are now. So this shows, first of all, that US import tariffs on Chinese exports are among the highest among all countries, so almost 50% here. Okay. And China is one of the countries that did not take those unilateral actions lying down. They retaliated any chance that they got. So you can see this throughout this time period, right? We check tariffs up, the blue line. The Chinese check tariffs up, the red line. And so US exports to China face a tariff of over 30%. This is high, right? Relative to what I've showed you has been common since the end of World War II, where we were in the 5% range generally, 3% for the US. This is considerably more. And what's also interesting in this is that this is just an import tariff on Chinese exports that the US has imposed. But when you look at all other countries, the general tariff is about at 18% for all countries, considerably more than the 3%. Conversely, the Chinese retaliated to the US measures. At the same time, they kept their tariffs relatively low with respect to every other country that exports to China. So that right there should tell you something about the relative competitiveness or the loss thereof that US businesses are facing in China itself. Now, let's talk a little bit about sort of the justifications that have been given for the tariffs and think a little bit about what those justifications mean and how a trade economist might think about them. So there's unfair trade practices, and these are things like illegal subsidies. Export subsidies are in fact illegal under the World Trading System, the World Trade Organization, WTO rules, or when firms are dumping, that is selling below cost or selling at a price that is much lower than its competitors. So there's always been trade rules against these unfair trade practices, right? And those were used as justification for some of the initial tariffs, certainly, like the ones on solar panels and washing machines. The other big thing, national security concerns. And here I actually put up a whole bunch of goods, specific goods that were hit with tariffs and with the justification of, hey, this is a matter of national security. And so some of these, sure, steel and aluminum, right? You need those to build weapons and that kind of stuff. Copper, that seems okay, perhaps. Rare earth minerals, right? Those are in all the chips, in all of our devices these days. Ship-to-shore cranes, they have something to do with trade and stuff that happens at the border when stuff comes in with ships. But then you have stuff like automobiles. So I have a harder time thinking of automobiles, imported automobiles as a national security concern. Lumber and products like kitchen cabinets and bathroom fixtures, right? So those prices are going up. A lot more of those goods that I haven't listed here. But then there's some new arguments. So those were things that you have seen for many years, for decades. Hey, there's some unfair trade practices. Hey, we need to be worried about national security. But what's new then is the argument that, hey, we also have had persistent trade deficits. So for a number of decades, the US has been importing a lot more goods than it has been exporting in value terms. And so that, of course, means overall there's a trade deficit. And that seemed to be something that the administration was very worried about, and that was sort of underlying this use of the International Emergency Economics Power Act to say, hey, this has really been a national emergency. We need to do something to address these persistent deficits. And then there was another new thing that we really hadn't seen before at all, which is, hey, we can also use tariffs as a cudgel to try and kind of beat other countries into submission and force them to agree to new trade deals, right? That's a consistent theme of, yes, we've had these trade deals over time, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, but they're really not advantageous to the US. We need to strike trade deals that put America first, right? And where other countries should give in and make concessions for us. So a lot of justifications here. What about them? So the unfair trade practices, as I said, those are actually rooted in US trade law. There's US trade law that says, hey, yes, if other countries subsidize illegally or if they are dumping goods in our market, that's something that can be addressed, but there's a process for it. So the Office of the US Trade Representative usually investigates, initiates those investigations. So this is Jamieson Greer is the US Trade Representative right now. And that is a process that takes months, if not years, to figure out what is going on there. And only if there's a finding that, yes, there is indeed some unfair trade practice going on, then US trade law says, yes, you can impose retaliatory tariffs to try and remedy that situation. So that seems fine, and that's something that has happened under many other precedents. National security concerns, as I said, I find it a little bit more squishy, right, to think about what is really a national security concern, but it's also rooted in US trade law. There's US trade law that says, hey, yes, if there's concerns with national security, that is a reason to restrict trade, but it also has to be following a process. So here the Department of Commerce usually takes the lead in investigating and determining how big is the damage, how high should the tariffs be, and really makes just recommendations to the president who then either says thumbs up or thumbs down. Addressing trade deficits more broadly, compelling countries to agree to trade deals, that's certainly contrary to World Trade Organization rules. World Trade Organization rules certainly admit that, hey, if there's some illegal stuff going on, like illegal subsidies, you can do something about that. But they don't address things like trade deficits or using tariffs as a cudgel. And of course, that is what the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional. Let me give you just a few more things, and I'm not going to go into much detail here. I'm just going to sort of mention things and see in the Q&A what people want to talk about, perhaps a little bit more. So Chinese retaliation wasn't just on tariffs. They also have some economic power. They control a lot of important rare earth minerals, and they control them both in terms of they have a lot of them in the ground, but they also control a lot of the processing that happens on those rare earth minerals, which are so important for so many devices. What also gets oftentimes lost is that, as I mentioned, we are in a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, so technically we shouldn't be imposing any tariffs there. It's a little bit complicated because those trade agreements are not really 100% free trade agreements. There's always some ifs and whens and other conditions implied there. So it is still true that we are adhering to those to the trade agreement, and only goods that are not actually in compliance with the rules of the agreement are subject to tariffs. Cars is one example here. I can go into more detail perhaps later if people are interested in. That's actually a very complicated industry here. Then, of course, came some exceptions, right? People liked their coffee and were upset that it cost so much more all of a sudden. That beef prices went up. Farmers were worried about their crops. They use a lot of fertilizers. So there was some very specific exemption as a result of specific people complaining about the increase in their costs. And then there's the soybean farmers who complained a lot because a lot of our soybean production used to go to China, and that was subject to the retaliation and was largely cut off. But farmers are an important constituency, and soybean farmers in particular complained a lot. And so the first wave in 2018 of the tariffs that affected soybeans caused a lot of damage and harm to soybean farmers. Then, of course, the next election was on the horizon, and so very quickly soybean farmers actually got compensated. And one of my favorite facts here is that the compensation that was paid, the billions of dollars that were paid to soybean farmers for the loss of their export markets, pretty much exhausted most of the tariff revenue that was collected at the time. So there we are. if you're a fashion maven, you might have noticed that those packages where you can direct order online, some nice clothes and other things like that, which usually came from China, they used to be tariff-free, up to $800 of value. They're now also subject to tariffs. Another money-losing proposition because, of course, administering tariffs is costly, and that was really the main justification for the exemption for low-value packets, right? That, hey, it costs more to figure out who gets these things, what should the tariff be, how do we collect that tariff on those things, then it was worth it. What about the effects of tariffs, right? That's what everybody wants to know. How does it affect our economy? How does it affect growth? How does it affect prices? So the nice thing for economists is that we did have these early tariffs, right, in 2018. So there's plenty of data there where we could look at what were those effects of the tariffs. And what economists in particular were looking for is who pays for those tariffs, right? So the official line is, hey, foreigners, of course, pay for those tariffs, those foreign exporters. Well, turns out when economists examined the data, what they found is that no such thing. Almost 100% of the tariffs are actually paid by the importers. So here you want to think some importers are, of course, businesses, giants like Walmart do some direct imports, but a lot of them are middlemen, where you have wholesalers, right, that import stuff and then turn around and sell them to smaller retailers. But the evidence and the data very clearly showed that almost 100% of those tariffs that were imposed here were in fact paid by the importers, that foreign exporters did not lower their price. They kept their prices largely constant, and you had to add the tariffs, and that's what the importers are paying. We have sort of almost a year worth of some data to look at what have these more recent tariffs that were much more broad-based, right, much more comprehensive. What has their effects been on prices? So here I have a chart that, I apologize, it's a little fuzzy, this chart here, but I'm going to try and show you what this shows here. So here we are right before this administration took effect, and these are retail prices. So this is a new project spearheaded by Alberto Cavallo at Harvard. And what they're able to do is to almost have real-time prices. So this is a combination of prices that you get through scanners that get electronically transmitted. There's some AI involved here to collect all those because official price collection is rather slow and comes in late. And what they were also able to do is they were able to distinguish between the prices of imported goods, that's your red here, and the price of domestically produced goods, not imported goods. And so essentially what they did is the dashed line that you can see here, this was the trend before tariffs were imposed. So you can see those retail prices were actually a little bit on a downward trend here. And then came the first tariffs, and instead of continuing that downward trend, they went up. So when you want to look at what is the initial impact of the tariffs on prices, what you can see here is that imported goods are about 6 percentage points higher. Their prices are about 6 percentage points higher than they would be without tariffs. And domestic goods, not imported goods, there's no tariff, no direct tariff on those domestic goods. They are almost 4 percentage points higher than they would be without the tariffs. So that's the very most recent data that I have available. They try to update this every few weeks. So I have seen a slightly more updated one that actually extends almost till the present day, and it looks pretty much the same. This trend has been going up the same way. We are more like at the 7 to 5% range now, where prices are that much higher for a wide range of goods. So these are about 350,000 data points that they collect every day. But there's other effects of tariffs, right, that maybe everyday people are less concerned about or don't know much about. So one of the purposes, of course, of tariffs is to protect domestic industries. So take steel, right? That's one of the industries that was hit early on with tariffs, and the idea was to protect domestic steel production. Steel has been subject to tariffs, temporary, more permanent ones, for many decades. You can go back to the 1960s to have the steel industry complain about foreign competition. So they get some protection, and they're supposed to become more efficient, and they do maybe a little bit, and then they complain again. So that has been a cycle that has been going on for quite a while. Since we did have those 2018 specific steel tariffs, we can, again, study what did they actually do? Did they create jobs? And the answer is yes, they did. There's over 1,000, 1,800 roughly, by some estimations, steel jobs that either were newly created or were saved because of the tariffs that would have otherwise disappeared. But then, of course, as economists, we also look at, well, how costly was that, right? So you can see here's the cost of the tariffs, and here is how many jobs were created. You do some math, and then it turns out for each steel job that was created or saved by those tariffs cost about $980,000. I don't know about you. I don't know any steel workers that make $980,000. The other thing I think that's important is that tariffs are regressive. And that means that folks on the lower end of the income distribution, right, poorer folks, are much more hit by tariffs than folks that are at the more upper end of the income distribution, richer folks, right? Simply because if you have lower incomes, you spend a lot of your income on food, on clothing, the basic necessities, right? And a lot of that stuff is imported, so the tariffs hit those folks a lot more. And so when you think about what is the tax impact, so the estimates for 2025 is that each household on average was hit by about $1,000 in extra costs as a result of the tariffs. Much of that was borne by lower income households, much less, and certainly relatively much less, by upper income households. And then when you think about businesses, what's really galling, I think, for a lot of businesses, and that affects the economy is that there didn't seem to be much reason or rhyme to some of those tariffs. And whether we have tariffs that, we impose tariffs tomorrow, then they're off again, or they're 145% one day, a couple weeks later they go down to 40%, then we pause them for a while, then we talk about 10%, maybe it's going to be 15%. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is clearly something that businesses hate. So what do we, or why are the effects maybe not quite as high as people have thought? So there's workarounds, right? So one thing that happened right away is, hey, if you in April announce that there's going to be tariffs that take effect in May, what you're going to do as an importer, you're going to try and import as much as possible before those tariffs take effect, right? And that's some of what happened, right? Those imports were front-loaded. Then you can shift production to other countries. So China lost a lot of production, not just because of the tariffs. There are some other reasons. Wages have been increasing in China quite a bit. So some production moved to Vietnam or Cambodia or some other countries that initially were not actually hit with broad tariffs. And I think that was part of the reason why now the tariffs are broad-based. So trying to shut down this avenue of like, hey, you can shift some production around fairly easily. Let's just go to a country with no tariffs or with lower tariffs. So that they try to shut down. And then, of course, when we think about these importers, right, how much of the cost of the tariffs that importers are paying are actually passed on to the consumers. So a place like Walmart, but also smaller retailers, are somewhat reluctant to just pass on the entire cost increase that they have faced to their customers. And so that's also why we see somewhat of a more muted response, at least initially. But you can also see probably that some of these workarounds are not going to be able to last, right? You can't front-load imports for a very long time, and whatever inventory you accumulated is going to get depleted. Now we have tariffs on everybody, so production shifting is not as effective anymore. And at some point, businesses will pass on those costs much more than they have so far. The trade deficit. Well, economists, and I'm not going to get into all sort of the theoretical reasons, have always been skeptical that import tariffs are actually going to do anything for the trade deficit, right? They might mute imports, they might reduce imports some, but then there's many mechanisms that ensure that usually exports get hit as well, and the trade deficit, the balance between exports and imports, doesn't actually change much. So the numbers for 2025 are in. Maybe not surprisingly, trade with China fell a lot, 29%, right? They faced the highest tariffs. They retaliated with tariffs, so both exports and imports went down quite a bit. A little bit with Canada, right? We had a little trade spat there, but they actually rose with respect to a number of other countries. Mexico was one of the beneficiaries, and then I have sort of some random countries that saw large increases. So Vietnam, that was still the production shifting here going on. That's why we saw a big raise. And overall, the goods deficit went to an actual record high. So rather than falling at all overall, the deficit even went up last year. Some countries made deals. Right? And here I have sort of a little overview. There's a page at that an economist at the Peterson Institute for International Economics maintains for all of us, so we can maybe try and keep track of everything that's happening. Right? So my excerpt here is just from 1 week of trade deals with Indonesia, Taiwan. So you can click through on some of those details here. So some countries did feel that they needed to make deals, and we can get into more detail here. Basically, trade deals historically have always taken a long time to negotiate. There's lots of details to attend to, lots of disagreements that need to be resolved. These deals went very fast, and they're very vague. There's very little detail in there. There's very little mechanism in there how things can be enforced, especially when it comes to investments. A lot of these countries agree to, hey, I'm going to invest 13 billion in the US, I'm going to invest 30 billion in the US, 50 billion, but it's completely unclear how that is going to happen, how you can force, say, private businesses to make those investments, where should they go, so who knows. So in the last 2 slides, let me be a little bit more general. So here's a view from international trade theory and policy, as I call it here. So this is just sort of a quick rundown for why, in principle, trade economists are in almost 100% agreement that tariffs should not exist except in very narrowly circumscribed instances, why tariffs should be very low. And the biggest thing is the theory of comparative advantage. If you understand that, then you know that trade is not a zero-sum game. And this is something that seems very, very hard to understand for politicians, especially politicians with a business background, right? So your intuition as a business person is like, well, if my competitor gains some market share, that's going to come at my expense. Then I'm going to lose market share. That's bad for me, right? But trade doesn't work that way, right? Trade creates new opportunities. Trade happens because it's advantageous for everybody. So you can go back to the Neanderthals, right? They were hunters and they were gatherers. The hunters, they got like the bears, right? They got the bear meat and they got the fur to keep people warm. And the gatherers got like the berries and all the other stuff that you can find. And they traded with each other, right? Because you can't live off berries alone. You want some meat. And of course, you want to keep warm. So trade happened naturally because it was to the mutual benefit of everybody. And in principle, that is still true. The problem, of course, is that, and we recognize that trade always creates winners and losers, right? If everybody benefited from trade, I don't think we would be here. We would be talking about something completely different. But it is true, yes, there are, of course, losers, right? Here in Maine, we have seen that over time. There used to be a thriving shoe manufacturing industry. Now we're down to like a factory in Skowhegan, right, from New Balance. You can look at textiles for the United States. We had a lot of textiles. All of that is largely gone. Most of the stuff is made someplace else. And that, of course, means that, yes, if you were attached to the shoe industry or the textile industry, you were losing out from freer trade, right? Your businesses were destroyed. You were out of a job, and that is clearly bad. But what trade economists always emphasize then in this context is that, hey, since overall trade is good, trade creates more wealth, trade leads to larger growth, it should be, in theory, possible for the winners to actually compensate the losers. And it turns out we have done a very, very poor job of doing any of that. And of course, as I said on the outset, economists really would like an orderly system, predictable rules, transparency, and we think that would be to the benefit of all. So in my last slide, let me give you a bigger picture, because I was also thinking about, okay, so here we have sort of some special circumstances, right? A president that's clearly very fond of tariffs, and that seems to be something sort of unique. But when we think about what has been happening sort of in the realm of trade in the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been a lot of signs that not all is well in the way the world trading system has been working. So These concerns about unfair trade practices that we've talked about, as I said, they date back many decades, but that's why we have the WTO. The WTO has clear rules, they have clear mechanisms by which to resolve trade disputes, but it hasn't really worked all that well in the last 20 or 25 years. So oftentimes, trade disputes take years to resolve. One example is there was a big spat on subsidies to Airbus and to Boeing, right? So it was a US trade dispute that took years and years to resolve at the WTO. And that's true for other disputes as well. So people for some time had lost some patience with the system and thought it's become less and less effective. We need to act more unilaterally. The last major trade agreement was the so-called Uruguay round that concluded in 1994 and actually formally founded the World Trade Organization in 1995. And nothing has happened since then. You might remember, if you're old enough, like me, that they tried to launch a new trade round in the late 1990s in Seattle. And you can easily find the pictures of Seattle, people in the streets, large-scale demonstrations, lots of police presence, and those things never went off the ground because there was a lot of resistance against more globalization already back then. So 2 years later, they moved it to Doha. No protests in Doha, right? No protesters got visas. That was very nice. And yet, the so-called Doha round has been going on for 20 years with no resolve in sight. COVID-19 actually showed us quite a bit about what happens when you have these far-flung global supply chains, and it showed the fragility of those supply chains. So there's certainly something to, hey, yes, if everything works well, and we have our products being done, being produced all over the world, like the iPhone is always a nice example, right? You can see the many countries that are involved in putting the iPhone together. It's not just China, there's South Korea, Japan, Germany, France, Mexico, the US, of course, itself. But COVID-19, this big shock showed us that, yes, these global supply chains are fragile. And so as a result of that shock, there has already been some what we often call nearshoring, right? Rather than producing, say, in China or even Vietnam or Cambodia, some of that stuff actually came back to Mexico. Not so much Canada, but really Mexico has benefited from that quite a bit. But it showed us that, yeah, there are some aspects of having such a intricate international production relationship that can be subject to problems when we have some shock. As I mentioned or alluded to earlier, there was no sort of pushback, no retreat to the old trading system, to low tariffs in the years before the active trade wars here. Although now there seems to be quite a bit more opposition to the tariffs because they're higher in magnitude, they're broader in scope, and so some more people, I think, than before are concerned about what that all means. But I think we are at a point where there's really no end in sight for broad tariffs, right? The Supreme Court says, hey, this is unconstitutional. We'll find another way of imposing tariffs broad-based, and we're going to battle things out in the courts. Chances are some of the other aspects are going to be declared illegal, but the administration certainly seems to be very much hell-bent on keeping these tariffs up. And that also means that the uncertainty stays there, right? How high are the tariffs? Who's going to be hit? With how much? What's going to happen tomorrow? So the uncertainty that businesses face is certainly going to continue. So this is what I view the state of the current system. Not a nice picture of a lobster here. So that's where we are, and I'm happy to discuss anything in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waldkirch, for getting us started. We do have, I'm sure you have a ton of questions. I have a ton of questions. Let me make sure this is working. It is helpful if you talk into the microphone for the questions because we are recording this for posterity. And we do like to start with the student questions. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to get us started. Questions?
Yeah.
Yay, Sam.
Alrighty.
Ooh, that's a little loud. Okay, a little further away. There we go. Particularly, I found it very interesting how you said that at the end of the day, it is true that trade creates winners and losers. And it appears to me that a lot of appetite for the tariffs, especially amongst the Trump administration, is kind of this perception that America is the loser of global trade currently. And they perceive this as kind of a way to extract compensation from the so-called winners. So if tariffs is the wrong way to go about extracting this compensation, what would a better way about the winners of global trade compensating those who have lost out?
So when I talked about winners and losers, when I think about this, I really think within a country, right? So my example with the textiles and the shoes. So I'm thinking about who gains from those things and who loses within the country. And so we have very sort of clearly identified groups that benefit from trade versus those that don't benefit from trade. Now, when you hear the argument from the administration that it's the US as a whole that has lost from trade. That's simply not true. I'm not sure how much more I can say about that, right? This whole notion of like trade benefits us all in principle, that notion is definitely true. And so for the US as a whole, I just don't see any evidence that anybody has put forward that we have lost overall. So the notion that the administration puts forward is this idea that trade deficits are detrimental to us. Never mind the fact that we've also imposed blanket tariffs on countries that we actually have a trade surplus with, like Australia, for example, still got hit by tariffs, even though we are selling more goods to Australia than we are importing from there. But the notion was here that trade deficits are bad. Right. And I guess the idea here is that if you think about it, right, as you are exporting, that makes you money, right? You're earning stuff if you want to think of this from a country basis. When you're importing things, you're spending stuff. So people think about this like a household, right? If I'm a household and I consistently have income that is less than what I'm spending, I'm going to be in trouble at some point, right? I have to go into debt. I have to pay back that debt at some point. One argument is this has worked well for the US for a number of decades, right? We've had these trade deficits, and yet we've had tremendous growth. We've done well as an economy, despite spending more in an international context than we are actually earning. So that's sort of just an observation here. But when you think sort of more closely, trade is not like a household. That's a bad comparison. So when I think of sort of my personal trade relationship, I run a deficit with the local retail store. So I go to the local Uncle Dean's, that's sort of the alternative store. I go to Hannaford sometimes. I buy stuff there all the time, right? Food and other things. I never sell them anything at all. So I run a really bad trade deficit with them all the time. Then when I think about my employer, Colby College, well, I'm actually running a great trade surplus with them. I provide educational services that I sell to them. They pay me okay, for all of that, but I never give them any money. It's a one-sided relationship. Is Colby College upset that they run a consistent trade deficit with me? I don't think so. I think they're quite happy with what I'm doing. Right? So that's sort of a long way of, I think, saying that this whole notion of, hey, we are losers because we have trade deficits, it simply doesn't hold any water.
I don't really have a question, but isn't it GDP per capita the explanation that you're looking for to answer his question?
What do you mean?
We have the largest GDP in the world, right? Because we're the largest economy, 30.6 trillion. Mm-hmm. You divide that by our population and compare that to China. I think that's the answer, right?
Okay, so you're certainly right that economists like to use GDP per capita, so the average income, as sort of a measure of how well are we doing on average. It says nothing about inequality and all of that stuff, right? But on average, we're doing really well. We don't have, by any means, the biggest GDP per capita in the world. We have the biggest GDP because we're a large economy, right? With the Chinese economy, it's always sort of a iffy how you measure all of that stuff. There's some mismeasurement. But certainly when it comes to GDP per capita, you have a bunch of countries around the world actually that have higher GDP per capita. But the point is that we have a pretty good GDP per capita, and GDP per capita has indeed gone up, right? That was my point of, we've done really well over these decades of trade deficits. Our GDP per capita has grown. On average, we have gotten richer consistently. So maybe that's a different way of answering this question, sure.
My question would be, if tariffs and all the uncertainty that is around tariffs, especially now, doesn't lead to more internal production or domestic production from the U.S., are there any clear avenues to rebuilding lost industry within the United States while also maintaining fairness in the international trade system?
That's a very good question, and there's a lot in there in that question. So let me sort of try to take a couple of angles here. If I wanted to be really provocative, I could say hey, there's some industries that are just lost and they're never going to come back, right? Nobody is advocating for the typewriter industry to come back, things like that, right? So that is just a normal part of the churning of the economy, a normal part of progress, that some industries become obsolete and there's really no point in trying to get them back. So that's sort of one thing which can be a little more provocative. The other thing I would say is sort of going back to my steel example, right? It's very, very costly, it turns out. Tariffs are some of the most inefficient ways of trying to encourage domestic production of something. But steel is also an example where reasonable people can say yeah, we do want a steel industry, right? We don't want to lose our steel industry. There's some good reasons and probably the most compelling industry for national security reasons. But we know it's very, very costly. So it turns out that the Biden administration, while they didn't really do much in terms of reducing tariffs, they did have some ideas on how to encourage domestic industry. They were thinking more of the chip industry, for example, right? Making more technologically advanced stuff that we think is the future. And what they encouraged, and there was the Inflation Reduction Act and a couple of other laws that put a lot of money into essentially subsidizing those industries, right? Providing domestic subsidies to encourage those industries to stay in the United States or expand in the United States. And that, it turns out, is actually a much more efficient way. So if you're looking for, hey, if as a policymaker we think that there are some industries of the future that we want to make sure are in the United States that serve our strategic interests, then there are just much, much more efficient ways of doing that, ways that are far less costly to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You mentioned that we should have been compensating the losers, and I think of the Rust Belt as well as the industries that you mentioned. How should we have been doing that? What would have maybe worked? Because I think the downside of not doing it is not only the whole trade stuff, but now you have people that are so unhappy that they have now gone towards the bad side of politics, if you ask me.
So it turns out that people have recognized, politicians had recognized quite some time ago that there should be some way of compensating the losers. And this dates back to the 1960s when there were successful rounds of negotiations at the predecessor of the WTO that lowered tariffs very broadly. And there was clearly a recognition that, yes, this is going to create some losers. So we came up with a program called the Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA. And that program was indeed supposed to do just that, to identify those that specifically were hit by trade liberalization, that lost their jobs or had lower incomes because of trade liberalization. And that should have been funded, right, with all the gains that we have. And you want to do things like not just give income subsidies, but you want to help people retrain, right, maybe subsidize taking college courses to acquire skills that work in the new economy where their old skills have become obsolete. So there's a whole range of things that can be done. There was never really any political will to fund this program adequately. That's one problem. So if you look now, the program is tiny, tiny, tiny. There's very few people that are in the program that benefit from getting subsidized retraining, getting other support in order to hopefully be able to participate successfully in the new economy, take the new jobs that we do have. So that is certainly one thing. The other complicating factor is that if you want to be sort of, again, provocative, if you ask some economists, hey, what should people do? Economists would always say like, well, they need to go where the new jobs are, right? So if you're in the Rust Belt or if you're in Appalachia where the jobs are disappearing, you should move to like Chicago or New York or San Francisco, right? Lots of new jobs that are in those areas. And it turns out people don't just react to economic incentives. They like their communities where they live, right? They like to be near their family and near their friends. So there's very little movement. We think of Americans actually as one of the most movable people in the world, right? We are very mobile. And when you look at the data, that's actually not true. Lots of people don't want to move. And then there's, of course, practical obstacles to that too. Things like it's costly to move, right? Buying a house or even renting in San Francisco, New York City is nothing like in the Rust Belt or in Appalachia. So there's those obstacles, and we're not apparently having the political will to subsidize those things, right? To say like, okay, if this is your economic obstacle and you're willing to maybe go someplace else, we'll help you with that, right? We help you move, we subsidize your rent maybe in a new place. There's no political will at all to do all of that. So we know what we should be doing, at least in part, with all the caveats that I mentioned, but that's not happening. And that's really frustrating for a lot of economists. And I'll add one more thing maybe that I should have also said earlier on. It also turns out, of course, that while theoretically I can talk very nicely about here's the effects of tariffs, here's the effects of trade liberalization, in practice this is actually really hard to isolate. Right? So if a factory closes or if a factory downsizes, tracing that back to specifically trade liberalization is not very easy because we also have automation, right? We have technological progress. So a lot of jobs change or disappear because of those reasons, because we make there's better technology, and oftentimes technology is labor saving. So if you look, at a car factory in 1950, you see some machines and your assembly line, and you see a lot of people. If you go into a modern car factory, you see lots and lots of fancy machines, computer-driven and all that. You see very few people in there, right? But that's not trade. That's technology.
I have a question for the future. The Supreme Court came and said that they didn't say we can't have tariffs. They said that the president can't impose tariffs. Only Congress can. So, and that the president was illegal in doing so. Mm-hmm. So he came out with this workaround. This I think it's Section 122, right? But I understand that does not refer to trade deficits, but to currency deficits. Maybe you can talk a little about that and explain that. In other words, 122 is probably illegal for trade, for tariffs.
Absolutely. So I will admit I'm, of course, no lawyer, and my knowledge of the legal stuff is somewhat on the limited side. But that was my first thought. Certainly in all that I've read since then is that, yes, they refer to some other obscure section, and the analysis was exactly what you said. This has nothing to do with trade deficits. This was a provision that was put into trade law because there might be currency emergency. So this kind of goes back to when we went off the gold standard, right? And we went to flexible currency. So there's certainly some concern about, hey, if there's a sudden shock and there's a big change in the value of the dollar, that is something we should concern about in the short run, right? This is also why the law says, hey, you can do something, but only for a limited time, 150 days, and then you have to figure something else out. So this is really something that buys the administration time again, because we have 150 days, but also it'll take the courts a while to say, okay, let's get behind this and figure this out, that this is also illegal. And then they're going to find something else. I mean, that would be my prediction.
Okay. This one here. I do have a question. Can you give me talking points to the assertion that tariffs can replace income taxes?
Oh my God.
And let's
They
pretend
cannot.
like my wife here,
That's the talking point. No.
my wife here is supporting it, and I'm the opposition, thinking this doesn't make sense.
It makes no sense at all. I mean, we are talking about very, very different magnitudes, right? I mean, you can see, sure, we have, with those high tariffs, we have collected billions of dollars in tariff revenue. And of course, there's also this question of, now that they're actually illegal, what are we going to do with this stuff that would actually be refunded to businesses? And that's sort of in limbo. But if you look at the magnitude of the tariff revenues and compare that to the magnitude of income tax revenue, it's several orders of magnitude different. So it's not even close to doing that. And also, you might have heard that there might be a refund check coming sometime because of all the tariff revenue. Don't count on it.
Where's the next one? Where? This one? Where? Well, there's one over here. Okay.
One of the things you talked about briefly there was that this administration has tried to use tariffs as a cudgel. And I wish you would just talk a little bit about what that means. It sounds like some of the capitulations by some of these countries that you gave examples of were not really new trade agreements, which generally take years to produce, but are soft or watered down promises. I don't know if there's a historical precedent for this, but over the course of time, if you are making kind of sort of enemies of what had been our friends, Australia and Canada and Mexico and others, do we know what are likely long-term implications? Eventually, Trump will not be in office, and eventually somebody else will be running the country. And my question is, will other countries likely come back to us, or is there any permanent or long-term damage done?
So if you had asked me this question at the end of the last Trump administration, I would have said, well, I think this is a temporary development. Countries are going to come back. And certainly the Biden administration did took some steps to repair those relations, right? But now that we are back and that things are more severe, I would say, than they were during the first Trump administration, I think there's been a really big mood shift. I think Europeans are now thinking that they are on their own. We are on our own. That's, of course, true in some of the political realm when it comes to defense and all of that. But I think it's also true in the economic realm that they don't think anymore that the U.S. is a reliable partner, that they can trust the U.S. in following through with its commitments, that they can't trust the U.S. anymore in following the rules of the game, of the trade game in this case. And so while there was some hope after the first administration, now I think the attitude is very much, hey, even if Trump is out of office, this is a relationship that has fundamentally changed and shifted. And it's unfortunate in many ways, of course, right? I mean, a lot of these countries have been our economic friends for a long time. When you look at the immediate post-World War II years, a lot of the prosperity of the U.S. that came during that time had a lot to do with war-torn countries, Germany and others rebuilding, needing a lot of stuff that we produced. So we benefited a lot from that. So that's unfortunate. But it's also unfortunate that we actually have a lot of common interests. So if you want to think about or talk about China, a lot of the accusations or the things that people are concerned about are actually true, right? The Chinese are illegally subsidizing a lot of industry. The Chinese, it's not a command and control economy like in the old Soviet Union, but certainly the state has a lot of influence, a lot of things that they can do in the economy. They can direct companies still to produce more. So in steel, there's clearly overcapacity coming out of China that is, of course, bad for all steel producers in other countries. And that's not just US steel producers, that's European steel producers, Indian steel producers. And they have certainly shown an unwillingness to rein that in dumping a lot of overcapacity in countries in Europe now that we have more tariffs. And countries are very concerned about that. When it comes to technology, there's certainly industrial espionage, but also the Chinese are making a lot of progress, I think, in a lot of areas like chip production, like AI. They're catching up very, very quickly, and certainly there's some danger that they're going to surpass us. So in many ways, Europeans in particular and the US should have common interests in trying to find ways to rein in some of the misbehavior that absolutely exists in China. And with what's going on with the adversarial relationship that has now developed, I don't think there's a real prospect for that kind of cooperation. And that would really be to the benefit of all. So yeah, unlike 4 years ago, I have a far less optimistic view on where this is all going. Right. Fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice.
Hi, I know it's, I guess, one question per person, but your answer there led me to a second one. So I'll start with my first question, which when you showed that graph of prices and overall the real-time data, it looked like things were increasing and prices increasing. Another economic term that's used a lot with price increases is inflation. So I'm just kind of curious, with these price increases coming from tariffs, how does that relate to, I guess, inflation, and does it act as an accelerant? And then my second question, for those misbehaviors you were kind of talking about coming out of China and how they're kind of overproducing steel as your example and flooding the market, I guess, could you expand on that further? When you're saying overproducing, is that they're clearly producing steel at a loss to then flood the market to drop the price? Or generally when it comes to trade, you're supposed to produce and have someone who's buying, and it's supposed to be kind of an equal equation on that side? And thank you.
Okay. Let me go to the first question first. So this is a tricky thing. So what I've showed you is increases in prices, right? So these are price levels, and I showed you how they were going up instead of keep sort of a small downward trend. Inflation is the change in prices, right? So if you have a jump because of the tariffs, that shows up as a change in prices, as higher inflation. But then if those tariffs stay the same, and the costs stay the same, and the prices stay at that elevated level, you don't have any further inflation. So this is kind of a one-off. And this is the view of the Federal Reserve. So I had recently an opportunity to talk to somebody who is at the Federal Reserve, and I asked sort of exactly that question. Is the Federal Reserve concerned that tariffs lead to sustained higher inflation? And the answer I got was like, no, we really think of this as a one-off, right? You have this tariff jump, so you have this price jump that shows up in a one-time higher inflation rate, but then if things stabilize at the higher level, you don't see higher inflation anymore. So they are somewhat less concerned about what that means for them and for monetary policy. When it comes to China, there's a lot sort of complex stuff going on. So China is in trouble. That is sort of one thing that people should be aware of. It has an aging population, so they have sort of a similar problem to other countries, that you have fewer and fewer people that work productively to finance the retirement of folks. And so that's one of the things that compels China to think about, hey, how do we solve this kind of problem? And so overproduction is a means of saying, okay, we need more growth from those that are still working in order to finance the retirement of others. Another thing that they do quite a bit is being strategic. So steel is maybe not the best example there, but when you think of chips and other sort of technologies of the future, I mentioned rare earths that they happen to have a lot of, but they also invested a lot in the processing of rare earths to gain sort of an economic power there. That's really what's also happening here, that China wants very much to be a greater economic power than they are now. They've grown tremendously over the last few decades. They're not there where we are, of course, but they certainly have the ambition to do that. And they see growing the economy by all means necessary as a way to achieving this economic power right? You mentioned earlier that, by GDP, of course, the US being a large country and being rich, we're still the largest economy in the world, but China is not that far away, and they certainly have that ambition to overtake us. And so some of it is indeed economic power play, and some of it is also what you sort of alluded to, that yes, it's also a means of trying to get competitors sort of out of the market, right? That's what the Europeans are afraid of. They don't really want to add tariffs, say, on steel imports and some of those other things, but certainly they're worried about their steel producers being, having this competition where the market is flooded, prices are so low or getting lower that domestic production becomes less and less profitable, and it might indeed drive some companies out of the market, and that is very much a concern, but this is also very much what I think the Chinese want.
Peter Navarro is kind of the intellectual underpinning of Trump's tariff policy. As an economist, can you kind of put yourself in his place and describe what his analysis is and what's wrong with it?
So Peter Navarro has a PhD in economics from Harvard, so he should know better than advocating what he should. I'm very certain that this is not what he learned in graduate school at all. I mean, he's been a long time. He's been sort of off the rails for a long time, very, very, very much outside of the mainstream of economists. So this is very much a minority view that he has. If you go sort of look back at the books he's written, well over 20 years ago, he wrote a book, Assailing China and the Chinese Ambitions. So he's always been sort of a nationalist in terms of what he was advocating for. But I would also say that in the first administration, I think he had quite a bit of influence in what the policies in this area were. He's still sort of like around like the ghost of Peter Navarro, but from what I understand, they don't really need him anymore because Trump certainly has embraced this notion of tariffs are good and a solution to almost any ill that is befalling us. So he's embraced that notion fully, and so I don't think he has actually a lot of influence. Calling it intellectual what he is, I wouldn't say that, no.
You spoke a lot today about winners and losers. I think back to when the U.S. cut its USAID program, and a lot of the international talk was how this was a gift to China, whether that's their Belt and Road Initiative or the outreach they're doing to countries in Africa. I wonder if you see a parallel there. I know there's been talk of a parallel there for trade. And as soon as the U.S. did all of these negotiations, if you want to call it that, you saw countries in Asia, Australia, other parts of the world redevelop a lot of the relationships they had cut with China for various regions because they said, we have to, out of necessity, we have to kind of get closer to China for all the different things that we need. So I wonder if you could talk more about what China's perspective is on all of this, especially since you said the countries in Europe and throughout the rest of the world might not come crawling back to us this time. Is this a gift that we'll just keep on giving? Thank you.
In a way, certainly. But you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think even more importantly than that, China has been engaged for, I would say, about the last 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, in economic diplomacy of sort of its own making. And it's sort of a very specific way that China has gone about that. And that's most visibly in Africa. So Africa, of course, most countries there are not doing very well. They trade very little. We trade very little with Africa, but they also trade very little with other countries. A lot of very poor countries. So they've looked for a long time for ways to spur development. And one way that the Chinese have taken advantage of that is to go in and say, like, look, we're not just looking for trade relationships, right? Have low trade barriers, and so we export some stuff to you, and maybe we'll buy some stuff from you. But they also recognize that more fundamentally, some of the reasons that countries are underdeveloped, countries are not able to take advantage of trade very much, is that there's a complete lack of infrastructure. So the Chinese have gone in and said, like, hey, look, we're going to build you a port, right? Like a really nice modern port where big container ships can dock, and that helps you with your trade. We're going to help you build roads, right? So some of the stuff that you want to sell might come from a mine in the interior of the country, so you need to ship that stuff to the port so that you can trade it, right? But they didn't have any money to do all of that stuff, so the Chinese come in and say, like, okay, we give you the money, we develop the road, we build you that nice port, but of course we want something in return. And that something in return is, yes, they want to get paid back, but more importantly, they want to have this kind of relationship where you are dependent on us, so we are your friend and not the US is your friend. So that has been going on for a while, but I think you're absolutely right that one of the dangers of the US retreating from these friendly relationships and turning them into adversarial relationships is that, well, countries want to have a friend. And the Chinese are there to say, like, yes, here I am, I'm your friend. So it's concerning, but it's not something that's sort of a new strategy on the part of the Chinese. So they've had this ambition for a while, but it certainly feels like we are making it easier for them.
I'm thinking of Maine, and over the course of the 80s, and I think you alluded to it earlier, but like Cheeseboro Ponds owned GH Bass and Health Techs and had 6,000 employees in the state in the 1980-81, and by 1990, there was one retail outlet of GH Bass over in South Portland, with most of it moving to the Caribbean. And looking back, was that a failure of trade policy that allowed that to happen? Maybe allowed is not the right word, but was that a failure of trade policy, and should or could there have been trade policy tools that might have prevented that sort of erosion? And that's representative of a lot of large swaths of the Northeast, but it's not clear to me where you think trade policy, what role, if any, it could or should have had in that dynamic.
I think the if any is the key here. I don't think that trade policy is an effective tool there. One thing, of course, is you can't, or we don't want to, hinder progress, right? That's just the natural churning of the economy, that some industries die and other industries rise. That's been happening for a long time, and it's part of the engine of growth. And it's hard. And it's hard for the affected people, right? And so if you are among the losers, right, if you will, of course you want some remedy. Of course you're advocating for, hey, can we make this better? And so if you feel that the competition or that the decline is due not to automation, technological progress, but it is due to trade, it seems natural to turn to trade policy. But as I have tried to argue, trade policy instruments are among the most ineffective or the most inefficient policy tools to try and deal with the kind of churning that's been happening, trying to help those that are negatively affected by the evolution of the economy. So yes, as I talked about earlier, not just as part of a trade adjustment assistance program, but more generally, how should we think about helping folks that are adversely affected for whatever reason in our economy? And we're doing a very poor job of doing anything, right? Job training programs, wage subsidies for transitions, subsidies to go to college. We have very, very little of that. And that's really what is a lot more efficient, a lot more effective, and lots of studies have shown those types of programs, but there doesn't seem to be the will to actually have those and to apply them broadly, and not to just say like, hey, we need to spend lots of bureaucratic time and effort thinking about, is this actually trade, so we can do the trade adjustment assistance, or is it for some other reason? It shouldn't matter what the reason is, right? If folks are adversely affected, we are rich enough that we should be able to figure out what are the most efficient ways of helping folks. It's not tariffs, it's not trade policy, it really is things like direct wage subsidies, helping you acquire new skills, whether that's through college training or through other skill training programs. Those are things that have been shown to work, but we're just not doing much of that at all. And that's a real tragedy.
We're about to go through it again with AI.
So I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. All right, Mr. Bell.
The Colby grad, yay.
Right, so, yeah, okay. We talked earlier, and I explained that I was an economics major at Colby College. And so in preparation for this talk tonight, I did reach out to some of my classmates. That we have an email chain, and we kind of coalesced on the thought that tariffs are evil. And having grown up in New England, they said, you know, for me to stay awake in this evening and pay attention to what you were telling is to say, equate tariffs to the New York Yankees. The New York Yankees are the one thing that we all know is evil in the world. And so they said, you know, for you to try to, you know, equate tariffs to being the New York Yankees. So with that said, is there anything that you can tell us that and leave us with? You showed us early in the United States benefited from having tariffs on products coming in the early years of our country, and it allowed us to grow to be this powerhouse that we are today. Is there anything good about tariffs that you can leave us with?
Well, thank you for this question. I'm not going to pass moral judgment on tariffs or the New York Yankees. However, yes, I didn't have much time to talk about some of the things that are good with tariffs, if you will. So one thing I did mention is that, yeah, if you have things that are directly affecting trade, like illegal export subsidies or other sort of supports or dumping in trade, that would also be my answer to you, is yes, in those cases, there's a reason that we have rules that allow for tariffs to remedy those things because they're directly related to tariffs. They're not unrelated, right? They're not having anything to do with automation or some other things that are happening. But going back to the 1870s, 1880s, when we had high tariffs, and that was to our benefit, this is what is known as the infant industry argument. So that is an argument among development economists that says, hey, if you have an industry that's just developing, that's small, that's not very efficient yet, that has to still figure out how to do things more efficiently, how to grow in scale, that's certainly a reason where you can say, hey, in order to make that happen, you might need some trade protection, some tariffs, but it's got to be on a temporary basis, right? So you've got to have some mechanism whereby you say, hey, yes, I will protect you temporarily, but I will keep a close eye on you. Do you actually develop? Is this an industry that's actually growing, that's actually getting efficient? And so when you look at sort of the arc of history, yes, the US in the second half of the 19th century is an example of pretty successful implementation of tariffs to develop industries. There's a lot of industries that did really well. Some might argue that they would have developed well even without tariffs, but that's another thing. But if you look sort of more broadly across countries and across time, there's many, many more examples where this strategy was deployed and was unsuccessful. So one spectacular failure, for example, is the car industry in Brazil, Argentina. They have a car industry, sure, and that benefited from many years of very high tariffs, and it's a very inefficient industry, even decades later after the first imposition of tariffs, because you don't have the right incentives here, right? If you're protected from competition and you have the political influence to keep being protected from competition, what's your incentive to actually become more efficient, to become competitive, right? You just go and ask for more protection, like the steel industry has been doing for many decades as well. So you have lots and lots of examples, but people always like to point to successful examples. So if you look at South Korea, that's one success story where these infant industry tariffs have largely actually worked, right? In the 1950s, South Korea was among the very poorest countries in the world, and now they are maybe not quite on par with us yet, but they're certainly considered a high-income country. They're doing very well, and part of that was they did actually succeed in developing some industries to become efficient, like the car industry, like electronics, right? We all know South Korean brands that are very nice and we can have at a good price and that are nice to drive or nice to listen to or whatever it is. So there are some of those success stories, but you really, the devil is really in the details, right? You have to build in mechanisms that actually do help make industries more efficient. you have to have some sort of timetable of like, hey, this protection is not going to last forever because then you have no incentive to do so. This has to ramp down at some point so that you really can show that, yes, this is successful, or we have to declare this a not so successful project. So it's very tricky in practice to have a success story here. It takes a lot more than just tariffs. It takes other measures, other incentives that you have to build in order to make this all work. Maybe one other success story I can tell that illustrates maybe a little bit more. So electronics in Mexico, not only did they sort of think about sort of how do you tinker with things, how do you tinker with the production process, but they also recognize things like, well, you actually need workers that have the right skills. So you also need to have skill programs. Costa Rica did that also very well when Intel went there, right? They recognized that, yeah, Intel is only going to be successful here if we actually have local folks that know how to do these jobs, that know how to produce this stuff. And so Intel paid for, or in partnership with the Costa Rican government, and similar things happen in Mexico, where it's like, yeah, we have partnerships with local universities, with local centers where there's job training, and we work very close together between private industry and those organizations to identify what are the precise skills that are needed here, what will make people successful. So there's those things as an example of, yeah, you need much more of that kind of stuff to make sure that there is success as a result of initial protection, and that then allows you, of course, to ramp down the protection. So there's some of that, but yeah, you need to work really hard on it.
As always, the last question that we have for all our speakers in this series, and thank you very much for this wonderful exchange. It's always great. We definitely have the best questions in the state of Maine, I think, in the World Affairs Council of Maine audience. But the last question we want to ask is, what advice would you give to the students in the room who might be considering a career in trade, or not trade, but trade policy, or in the study of economics, or all of these different things? What should they do and consider?
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for all the questions, and there were some tough questions here, but I enjoy the kind of dialogue, and we could go on forever, of course. So advice to students. One thing, of course, is the more education you have, the more interesting things you can do. So this is not to say that everybody needs to get a PhD. There's great master's programs, in specific master's programs in international development or in public policy, environmental policy. There's a whole range of things. And you have top programs like the Harvard Kennedy School, for example, but there's a lot of other programs there that are accessible to many people. Indiana has a great policy school where you can sort of focus on either environment or international economics or development. Georgetown has some great places like that. So more education allows you to do more interesting things. My second piece of that is more and more we have opportunities to try it out, meaning like to figure out like, okay, so what does this mean? What kind of research do people do, whether that's economists or anthropologists or sociologists? And so more and more we have what are called research assistant positions in various organizations that give you a taste of what serious researchers are working on, and they give you an opportunity to network. So a top example would be the JPAL lab at MIT. That's a very big development lab. Lots and lots of economists, anthropologists, and some others are working there. They employ lots of research assistants where we can see how does this work in action, right? What are people thinking about? How do they try and do research that translates into policy that makes people's lives better? I think that's what the motivation is behind many of those. But it doesn't have to be a top program like that. It can be institutions in Washington, D.C., close to the policy power. There's the Peterson Institute for International Economics that I have sort of a lot of relationships with. But there's lots of other think tanks that hire people out of undergraduate to say like, hey, we're going to pay you something and we're going to show you how do we actually think about policy. How do senior people do this kind of stuff? What are the opportunities? Who can I connect you perhaps with, given your specific interests? So I think that's where you want to put yourself out there and look for those kinds of jobs, right? Not the corporate sector, but really institutions. Federal Reserve is another one. If you're really into economics, they hire a lot of those research assistants. And so these days, some prominent researchers from the last 10 or 15 years, they started with that kind of thing. It's like, oh, I'm not sure, so let me be a research assistant and actually see research in practice, the kinds of questions people go think about, what they care about, what are the means, what are opportunities. Then people all of a sudden have an opportunity to go, say, to Kenya, do some field research, get their hands wet there, get to know local people. So those are the kinds of things that I would urge you to try and explore and maybe do.
Those opportunities, you never know where they're going to take you. It's the serendipity theory of career advancement.
Which is life, right?
Right, which is life, which is what makes it so wonderful. Again, thank you, Professor Waldkirch, for being here this evening and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and helping us make sense of this thing that is in the headlines all the time, but now we've got some real knowledge and some talking points. Thank you again to our sponsors. We could not do this without your support, and of course the support from our membership. If you're interested in becoming a member, because you're not one already, we've got information out there on the table. As a reminder, the World Affairs Council of Maine is a nonpartisan organization. The speakers' thoughts and comments do not necessarily reflect ours. However, questions regarding the Red Sox and the Yankees, I mean, we would allow Yankees fans to come to our events, but thank you all for being here tonight and have a wonderful evening.
And our next event
And
is
our
on
next
March
event.
26th.
Thank you.
It's on Africa, the U.S. and Africa, so don't miss that one.
Very good.
No, I'm not going to give that to you. Yes. Thank you.